This afternoon in partnership with Open Banking and Banking for Net Zero. I'm Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this panel on how we can apply the lessons from open banking to other areas of the economy, such as energy, digitise the economy and unlock benefits for everybody. I'm delighted to be joined by a stellar and large panel. I think this is the largest I may have ever done, 5 panellists, not counting myself, obviously, as the chair. We have Marion King, Trustee of Open Banking. We have Hannah Cool, Chief Operating Officer of Banking for Net Zero. Sheree Howard, Executive Director of the FCA. Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of Energy UK. And my sparring partner, Paul Scully, former Minister for Tech and the Digital Economy. We will be doing this in the normal format. If you've done any Conservative Home events before, I'm sure you know how it works. There will be opening remarks. There will then be a discussion up on here, and then we will throw it to the floor for questions. Normal rules will apply. Please don't just, if you have a statement that's not related to the discussion that's about to happen, let go of it now. Come to terms with that and think of a question, because it's just going to spare me yelling at you later. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass us to Marion to kick us off.
Thanks, Henry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marion King, Chair and Trustee of Open Banking, and I sit on a number of other industry boards as well. So Open Banking UK, now some 6 years old since the CMA order, which was a piece of law that mandated that 9 banks must share current account data through standardised APIs for the benefit of a smart data economy and all the use cases that can build from that. So this is for public good, as well as for the economy, to provide growth and innovation across, starting with the financial services sector. So where are we now? The roadmap that was launched in 2018 is complete. So all of the work of the 9 individual organisations is now completed, including the 3 institutions supporting Northern Ireland. So that is done, and that happened this year, which is a huge milestone. And I think it demonstrates that when something is mandated, with milestones, with standards, with regular reviews, it gets done. In addition to that order is what Open Banking Limited does, which is monitoring. So it isn't just, launch the APIs, off you go, thank you very much. It's monitored on a monthly basis. And as trustee, part of my role is to make sure that the standards, the conformance is supported, availability, access, technical performance, as well as working with these organisations to help them through their own changes. They make technical changes. They're moving to the cloud or doing something within their enterprise architecture, which will impact the work that they do with open banking, and we're there to support and help. And so it's constantly evolving. Those standards that were launched in 2018, there's a big new version been published this year, and that will start. So it's maintaining the order now, it's maintaining the standards, making them modern and appropriate for today's society. And what does that mean in terms of usage? Well, we're seeing now 11 million active users every month. Currently, the big use cases are around payments, the current account and credit decisioning. There are many more, but we need to move to the next phase of open banking in the UK. Now, to get open banking in context in the UK, we've done a really good job. We, the ecosystem, the banks, the TPPs, the providers, the regulators, the trade bodies. This is a joint effort to get to where we are today. And we see use cases like HMRC have already collected £27.5 billion utilising open banking for tax income. Easy to do, painless to the consumer, and a simplified way of enabling payment flows. So there are some quite extraordinary high-volume use cases happening today. We transact more than 5 times the number of API calls than the rest of Europe put together. We have more than nearly 3 times the level of payment flows utilising an open architecture gateway. So we're way ahead of our European counterparties. That being said, we're seeing open banking now in multiple jurisdictions globally, notably Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, Australia, Canada, US. And we're seeing open banking move in different ways, some centrally controlled, some more fragmented. we're doing a really good job. This is really strong for the economy, but the next phase is really important. To have a data sharing economy, all organisations have to share their data. They will not do that because there's no business case to support it unless it's mandated. And it has to be mandated around standards and structure so that data can be shared and is interoperable. Without that, we don't have a data sharing economy. And we need the Digital Information and Smart Data Bill to enable that mandation. Also, to enable other sectors beyond banking, beyond financial services, to stand up a trust framework with rules, standards, monitoring, as I've said, to make sure this runs efficiently, to allow the innovation within those sectors to get the benefits from smart data.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up is Hannah.
Amazing. Good afternoon, everyone. Hannah Cool, Bankers for Net Zero, B4NZ. I just wanted to step back. Our mission is really simple, and it's how do we mobilise capital at scale to meet our net zero goals, but most importantly, allow for sustainable growth. Now, you might be thinking, what does that have to do with open data? It's incredibly important to unlock the innovative potential of businesses across the market, as well as reducing friction around sharing sustainability information. Now, that is a huge barrier at the moment to SMEs across the market, as well as major organisations. And our mission is to work alongside these esteemed panellists and hopefully all of you in the room to unlock a more ambitious framework and use of smart data across our marketplace, because the impacts are potentially huge. You know, when I think about the sustainability imperative, meeting our net zero goals, but doing that in a way that unlocks growth, the only way we can do that is through leveraging information that already exists. Now, we incubated something called Project Perseus alongside another organisation called Icebreaker One. Now, that project is all around automating the flow of energy data from SME through to bank. With that information, banks can actually start to produce products that incentivise different sorts of behaviours. At the moment, it's incredibly difficult to create sustainability-linked products that really unlock behaviour change at scale with a commercial case, not just a regulatory and compliance case. So, you know, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today because open data is absolutely critical.
There we go. Thank you. Next up, we have Cherie.
Good afternoon. So there's little doubt that open banking has transformed an element, and I'm very clear to say an element of financial services. It's shifted and fostered competition, it drives innovation, and it also promotes financial inclusion. So we've already heard from Marion about some of the innovative solutions that it has started to drive. And they're really important as part of moving this forward. It's also had a much wider economic impact. But you've also heard from Marion that other people are sort of catching up. Other countries have got a long way to go, but nonetheless, we have got to continue to invest and foster change in this area. So the FCA is really committed to its role as chair or joint chair of the Joint Regulatory Oversight Committee, which we jointly share with the Payments Systems Regulator. And on which the CMA, who, as Marion referenced, mandated the banks sharing their data in the first place, and HMT. So we're committed to developing the future entity of open banking and driving this forward. But actually today is about what's the possibility, where could this go, how could we unlock the potential that open banking has shown us is there.
Thank you very much. Emma.
Sharing microphone. I said this earlier, but when you go like third or fourth, everyone's already said the smart stuff. Why are we in the energy sector interested in open data? And I thought, I'm going to assume that not all of you are energy nerds, and usually for an audience I'm speaking to. But so to take a step back, we're moving from an energy system where largely we're putting large kit on the end of a network, which then, where power is moved pretty straightforwardly to your home, and you may have had a dumb meter and someone bills you, to a world where you may have an electric vehicle, you might have a heating system that's capable of doing something we call load shifting because it's electric. You might have a battery in your home, you might have solar panels in your house. You might be using any of those technologies to export energy to the grid or to self-consume it. In some models, you might be sharing energy with your neighbours or selling it to them. This is true that this is potentially possible. We've got, on the other end of the system, multiple kinds of infrastructure, from small batteries up to large-scale batteries, wind farms, traditional forms of generation, and all of those things are also interacting with offices, businesses, industrial sites, and all the points across the energy system, to the extent that where we used to have a couple of data points, enough data points in the grid that I could probably count them in my hands, and we'd manage the grid accordingly. We're now talking about a world where you've got a multiplicity of data points and interactions at what we call the demand level of the system, so your homes and businesses and on the supply side. Making that work together efficiently without having to build an astonishing amount of infrastructure requires us to understand it. And so we're interested in open data in a few ways, and just to quickly cover them. Firstly, we serve 28 million households in this country. We're carrying about £3 billion worth officially of debt on the supply side. We've got customers unable to pay their energy bills. We often struggle to find out who they are. Smart meters have really helped us work out where people are struggling, but it's difficult to share that data with government, with agencies that can help them, with consumer groups. It's difficult to work out if customers are struggling to pay their bills because they might not have energy efficiency in place. So we're looking to get better data that we can share with third-party providers who can help them. We're actually engaged in a live project at the moment to try and get DWP to share data about where they think there are vulnerable people and match it with where the energy sector thinks we've got vulnerable customers, for example. And it has been 10 years of my life trying to get that to happen, and that's just a small example. So there's options to look after people, to know where we should be targeting support to do that efficiently. The middle thing is there are options to provide you all with better services. If we understand how you're using energy, if we understand who has an electric vehicle, we can offer you new tariffs and services. We're already paying people to use their EVs and batteries at different times of the day with a benefit to the grid. And being able to understand that properly allows us to target commercial products that make money. And that, in turn, reduces the cost of net zero for any of you interested in that world, because it's a commercial imperative. We can then offer you the technologies back cheaper because we know we can offer products and services on the back of them. And the third thing, and possibly less relevant to this conversation, but the network is going to be a big challenge over the next 10 years. Let me tell you that quite often we don't know what is actually switching on the distribution network or where it is, and we're getting better at installing lots of sensors when we're putting in new cables. But we would love to have more sensors right across the grid system, and particularly on the distributed bit of it, so the more local level bit of it. Because when people are doing things like using their EVs or turning on a battery, it's often very hard for us, looking in the control room or anywhere else in the energy system, to know exactly what's on and where, and to manage it efficiently. If we manage the system efficiently, we build fewer pylons, and I think that will be quite a popular message with the public. So there you go.
Fair. Yeah,
Fair.
Thank you very much. And finally, Paul.
Thank you very much, Henry. Good to be here. Now, before we started, Sherry and I were bonding over getting excited about insurance. Now, let me not be a party pooper here. I'm just about to be excited about standards. So, this is how I flow. This is my rock and roll lifestyle these days. Standards are really, really important, and because over the way Taxpayers Alliance, Popular Conservatives, etc., they may be having discussions about how you cut regulation, and I'm all for cutting sensible regulation that we can cut, but good regulation creates markets. It actually creates confidence with companies and individuals, consumers as well. So it's really important that we build on those standards and actually, as I say, create those markets out of it. Britain has got an amazing history of whether it's BSI, whether it's UCAS, and now in this context, open banking. We had to go through hell and high water to get to this point, as Marion has attested to, with mandating banks to actually start sharing their data. There's so many companies, when you get to this kind of level where everyone thinks that what a lovely idea, they say, yeah, but I don't want to do that as my business. I want everyone else to do this. So we had to go through quite a painful program of passing legislation to mandate the banks to actually share their data in a way that would be useful for open banking. And it's something now we use every day, in our everyday lives, but importantly, companies use that in their transactions, micropayments, etc. And you can combine that with AI to sort of detect fraud and other patterns that we've just been discussing about in energy. And those of you in the room, to go back to standards, some of you will have a Google phone, some of you will have an Apple phone, and you may have got here to Birmingham using Apple Maps or Google Maps or such like. First of all, you can charge your phones using the same connector. That's a good standard. But you'll also be using standards, the APIs that actually feed public transport figures into those maps, and that all comes together in something that's really useful for us. Similarly, though, open banking has done that same thing that we just almost take it for granted now. There is no accident that the UK has more unicorns than France, Germany, and Sweden combined. Many of those are in fintech, and that is possible because of the pioneering work of open banking. But then we've got to start now thinking about what comes next. Because if you look I was in India for the G20 last year when I was still a tech minister, and they are doing an amazing work there. They have a thing called MOSIP. And so whereas we're working on digital identity here, they're well ahead of us in that regard, so that you can actually get an app, the MOSIP app, which really starts combining public and private access to services, and they trust it. So to the extent that, if you think about India, and we all know about the economic boom in India in the big cities, but think about the rural villages that still exist, that are still have struggling with their economies. They went from 8% banked to 80% banked across the whole country in about 15 years. And that's this technology that's been able to, and MOSIP that's been able to drive that. And how they've been able to do it quickly is because they've been able to leapfrog that. They didn't have the legacy of the banks to have to mandate them. It was that political drive from Narendra Modi who really gave the architects of that system. So you go, you build this, and that's for the betterment of India, which they're now able to leverage into developing countries and lead the way in supporting developing countries. But also France are interested in that technology. Similarly, you go to Ukraine, they have a thing called the DIA app, which again is a similar type of thing, public-private collaboration. Now, the problem with that is it's a great system. Something like 80% of Ukrainians use it. It's a very young population in Ukraine, use it day in, day out. Now, when it was described to me on a PowerPoint presentation by the Ukrainian technology minister, she said, yeah, this is great. We've got this government super app. And I said, well, let me stop you right there. If I sit there and start talking about government super apps, then I will be hounded out of office even quicker than we were eventually in July this year. And so we've got to be careful how we do it, because the problem is part of that I talked about the legacy of the banks. We've also got a slight legacy of a mistrust of data sharing, despite the fact that businesses and individuals do this on an hourly basis, if not a minute basis. Every time you pick up your phone, people know, or the companies know anonymously what you're doing, so that it can send you contextual advertising, so it can look at patterns, etc. So we need to move on to the next stage. We've got open banking, it's working really well. We need to move further towards open finance, so other financial products can join, whether it's insurance, whether it's savings, etc. And then indeed to open energy for the reasons that we've just heard from Emma as well. But that's going to take big political leadership. It's going to mean that actually we've got to grasp this, and if we're going to move on to the next stage, we don't want to have to get to the point when we're just pushing through legislation. You might have the risk that we have in doing so is that a pure free marketeer may say, well, hold on a sec, government has no business in this. Problem is the market is slightly fragmented. We do need the political leadership to piece it together. Then the Labour Party will actually sit there and say, you know what, we might start gold plating that mandating, which we don't want to happen. We want the market to flourish, and we want to allow it to flourish, but we need to guide it, we need to nudge it, we need to push it along. And that will take strong political leadership, having a single minister that is actually looking after this, overseeing this. Now, let me say one nice thing about Keir Starmer. It's probably the only thing that anyone said nice about Keir in the entire conference, is that he's talked about his missions, and he's not going to be able to deliver on them for any number of reasons. We can see the way that it's the Labour conference has gone, the last few weeks has gone. But the idea is sound in terms of cutting through the silos of government. Because if you're going to have that political leadership, you can get really ensconced in a treasury mindset. Well, I used to be in what was then BAYS, the business department. You get your own area there. If you're in local government, there's even more of a silo in local government. These kind of things. So, and it takes a lot to unmesh government working. So that strong political leadership is something that we're really going to do. And then just let 1,000 flowers bloom, frankly. Let the market do its thing after that. That's what good Conservatives are about, and that's what good leadership should be about.
Lovely. Right, now this is the bit where I get to briefly hijack things and all the specialists in the audience can grind their teeth while I ask them incredibly basic questions. I will just reiterate, if you hold on to your statement in the hope that I will let you say it, just, again, let it go. Can't think of a question. So my first question is really to Marion and to Paul, and it's sort of two questions, which is, I've done a lot of these, and I write about policy a lot. And normally when you're writing about British policy, especially on anything to do with infrastructure or big, it's a really sad occasion. There will be a lonely violinist somewhere in the background, and it will all be about why this didn't happen or that didn't work or whatever. And I can't remember. I actually can't remember the last time I sat on a panel and someone was like, "Yeah, we crushed this. We had a 3-year thing, and we've knocked it out of the park, and now it's the next step." So I guess the question is, to Marion, how much of that was due to specific conditions in banking, as opposed to things that could be more generally applied? And to Paul, why wasn't this, if this was such an effective means of driving change, did it not seem to be used more widely in government? This method.
Well, yeah. I mean, to be fair, there's always a reluctance to make, to mandate big banks to do anything, and any big company's got a big lobbying budget, frankly. So it's always that relationship you've got to break through. And frankly, working in government is something like wading through treacle. So it is very, very different, and there's always different priorities. So to do more, to go that little bit further, bearing in mind, as you say, the legislation went through in 2018. Obviously, COVID kicked in, and Brexit and all those kind of things meant that we really didn't develop the Smart Data Council that I was working on as much as we might have done to go to that extra level. But now, I think if we're all talking about growth, and I go back to the fact that Labour Party might be talking about growth, it's something that we have been laying the foundations for. We've all got to go to growth, but can only do it, or we would best do it, if we're actually using all the tools. And that's that mandatory, that's just the push first. Hopefully we don't have to go through legislation. Legislation should be the last resort, not the first resort.
I think, just to give you an anecdote for the next one,
Right.
In terms of open banking, and remember the stats I said about Europe? Well, the good thing about open banking is PSD2 happened and the CMA order at the same time, both pushing for API sharing, standardisation, etc. So for the large banks, they had two masters and they could overlap. So it was quite useful in terms of timing. But when you think about the level of open banking usage in Europe, and what I said about the UK, we crushed it. Absolutely crushed it. And the difference was the CMA 9 order. That's the difference. It wasn't PSD2. It was the CMA 9 order. It made it happen, and we maintain it. And it's a very positive set of relationships, and the infrastructure works incredibly well, touching wood. There are no breaches. We've got none of the CMA 9 below the standards that were set with the order. So it's working incredibly well. The hard bit now is the next phase. And the reason why that's so hard is because the banks have funded this to date.
Yeah.
And to be frank, they're getting a bit fed up with it. And when Apple come in and use open banking for Apple Pay, so that when you make your double-click Apple payment, up can come your balance, promoting responsible spending, that's free, because the banks have paid for it. So what we need now is a commercial framework, a pricing model that's fair for all, that those that use it pay, not just those who created it. We need to expand it beyond the 9 to all other financial institutions, and we need to have all those who hold data that's relevant for the use cases and the markets we operate in to share that data within that trust framework against those standards. And what's happening is it's voluntary post the order, and it's not happening. Great use cases, great models happening. Third-party organisations are not sharing their data. So I'm now stepping in with their CEOs and saying, how can I help? Why isn't this happening? This is going to need mandation from the regulator. Because if you have to put budget behind something and there isn't an obvious business case right now, it's not going to make the cut at the board meeting. It has to be mandated. It has to be mandatory investment rather than voluntary investment. Unfortunate, but that's the reality of where we are. Once we get to that, it then starts to become, a ubiquitous capability such that the vulnerable energy consumer, their data coupled with bank account data, coupled with government data, can map those vulnerable households and help. Help match the expenditure with the energy usage and give tools and capabilities that give them choice and control. That's where we need to get to. And we're quite some way off that.
But we have to be better at storytelling, and you paint a wonderful picture of what's possible. I think in the market, the recognition of what's possible and what is coming is not articulated consistently enough, and recognising as well that the points of difference against why would we not share data. I hear a lot, I don't want to share my data. Your point around banks aren't sharing the data.
Yeah.
The point around this comes with consent models. This comes with trust frameworks. You will be more in control of your data in an open data model like we are suggesting than we are currently. If I think about the energy and sustainability story that I work with some of my customers and clients on, is at the moment there is no control of your sustainability story. You voluntarily publish metrics and they're gone, they're out in the ether, they're in the marketplace. Actually, an open data sharing model means that you are in constant control of your story, of your narrative, as well as then languishing in the results, the efficiency savings, the fact that people can create products and services that will benefit you in time. I think that's the story we need to tell.
Okay. I do want to comment on that, or is it going to...
Well, you asked about why hasn't it happened.
Yeah, I did.
So, yeah,
go on
I can
then.
tell you why it hasn't happened in energy.
Please do.
Why hasn't it happened? So I think we should distinguish really quickly between stuff the market is incentivised and won't argue about and will want to do, and will do, and the kind of data that can be helpful to the whole market share. And I highlighted the data about who is vulnerable. And there is a regulatory requirement for suppliers to be rolling out insulation services, some clean heating technologies, as well as financial support to a subset of customers. They're also required to be the ones that find them, and it's getting increasingly difficult to find them. And that's partly because they are required to target particular demographics, which they might not hold the data on, whereas DWP or government departments do. And or it can be difficult to see someone's energy use if they're trying to target fuel poverty, and that often depends on the smart meter rollout. Both the smart meter rollout and data sharing across departments has been an absolute nightmare for the 10 years I've been working. And so there's a few things in this which we should be honest about that are difficult for government to do, where it makes a big difference. The first is absolutely sharing across departments, and we'll see how it actually goes, but that idea to have, a unifying thing across departments and try and get the Whitehall machine to work together is quite a good one, and would help with this. I think the idea of a regulator working out which data is in the interest of the whole market and mandating standards is also helpful, and I will tell you, in an off-the-record, on-the-record way, that a lot of the conversation we're having at the moment about data is where can you get the suppliers to be comfortable basically sharing information, and a lot of that is down to trust in the regulator to set up a framework that they can all get behind. That's exactly the same conversation in my sector. And the other thing, and this, no one's mentioned it, but you have to have someone who's really interested in the brief, who knows their stuff. This is a complex area. There aren't that many people that really fully understand it. Obviously all of us on this panel do, but when I was looking at digitisation in the energy sector a few years ago, the regulatory team in Ofgem and the energy regulator only had 2 people that were looking at data and digitalisation across the economy. I think they've staffed up a bit since then, but nevertheless they have 2,000 staff, so just as an indication. And in government, it often depends on ministers really understanding and getting an idea of their brief. And again, not to give too much credit to a Labour government at a Conservative conference, but this is a cross-party comment. I have rarely seen people sitting in the retail brief in energy that are genuinely passionate about it, and that's because everyone wants to do the fun hard hat stuff with like pylons and wind turbines, or not fun. But nevertheless, it's sort of when you think about energy where you want to be. at the moment, the Energy Minister in Labour has come from a more consumer-focused background and an economics background, and it is making a difference in her interest in the job and therefore that willingness to work with colleagues in other departments. So I think it's also about making sure we make this bit of the brief, the consumer bit, the retail bit, interesting, politically interesting, economically interesting, interesting to all of you. Some of that storytelling, some of it is trying to get people with expertise into those jobs. So, long may it last that we've got someone that we haven't killed the enthusiasm for energy retail in the department. But I have worked with ministers who really do understand this. They very rarely get those briefs in government, and I would love to see more of that expertise.
Okay. Sheree, on the regulatory side of this, like whenever I hear about data sharing being a troglodytic dinosaur with phone 3 generations behind the current and all the rest of it, the fear is always security, right? And it seems that problem gets bigger the more data sharing you have, because it's one thing to have it within one sector, within one industry, which is presumably overseen by one regulator, but if you're going to have data sharing between finance and energy, presumably that's then cutting across different regulators. Yeah. How does the regulatory framework keep pace with this to make sure that user data is secure and that the whole thing doesn't become, whilst potentially having a lot of upsides, a lot of huge liabilities as well?
I just will go back on the storytelling just one moment, because actually storytelling starts with the public, actually, a bit. Because at the moment, I think if we were going to talk about one of our learnings from the setup of open banking, those who use it can understand and see the tangible benefits that it can drive. But there is a natural reticence in the UK to sharing your data, right? There is something in people's mindsets that, even though it's a consent model, even though it's secure, and I'm just talking at the open banking bit here, there is that natural reticence. So we have got to get people into understanding that it is secure and that the right data standards are being put in place and the right controls are being put in place and the right cybersecurity, etc. So coming back to your point, the Smart Data Bill needs to set those, work to set the standards across. So we've got good standards in open banking, but if we're going to open this up, that's got to apply everywhere, but everywhere's got to, the public have got to understand the controls that are in, or that there are controls in place and that it is safe, and that when they give their consent, those standards are applied. And so, coming back to Marion's point, in the last 6 years or so, there's never been a data loss. There's never been an incident in open banking, and that's the key point. And those are some of the stories we need to tell. People currently in the UK do not realise how often and how much they're sharing their data without realising, actually. And therefore, how do we tell them to do that smartly, and how do we educate them to do that smartly is a critical thing.
And whose role is it to do that? It's probably all of us.
It's everybody.
I've worked in a major bank, I've worked in a major card scheme, I've even worked for the low carbon contracts company. All of these government departments, non-government departments have a role to play here.
Absolutely.
And I think it could well be the stories that help vulnerable and those who are finding life harder. I think also it's going to be smart data with AI. The smart data is the fuel that goes into that clever engine that helps society, that cracks the problems with fraud, with cybercrime. Utilising data and watching patterns with AI and machine learning to keep improving the learning are going to be what makes citizens safer. So it's a difficult conundrum to get your head around, and you're absolutely right. I think it was at the Conservative Party last year, and I said, raise your hands if you use open banking, and about 3 people raised their hands. I asked them to raise their hands if they look at their aggregated bank balances on a banking app, and about 2/3 of the audience put their hand up. So you don't have to know that you're using open banking.
No.
You just have to know that it's safe and secure. And once these stories come out of helping people, helping them get the benefits they deserve, helping them save the money that they need, helping SMEs run their businesses far more efficiently, helping people with a plethora of data and forms and proving who I am every single time they try and do something, that's when it will start to break through. But it isn't just the government's role. It isn't just open banking's role. It isn't just the bank's role. It's everyone has got to change the language and the narrative that this is a really positive thing. And use the stories and the use cases that resonate for you, resonate for your sector, and the imagine if stories that haven't even happened yet.
It's a difficult balance, isn't it, actually? Because you sort of, so many people, for the reasons that you say, they don't know they're using it because they take it for granted. Some data show they take for granted until you ask them directly about the sharing the data, and then suddenly the Russians are coming, the bots are coming, and the scams are coming, etc., etc. Whereas the truth, can't be further from the truth. Exactly as Cherie says. So you've got the taking for granted next to government's involvement in data, and inevitably, when I was trying to work on digital identity, using government almost as a sort of passport rather than a control of your data. People roll back to ID cards and these kind of things. They worry about the I think someone said about how the UK has a particular view on data sharing. Yeah, exactly, and which is not particularly helpful 15 years later when, as I say, it's autopilot now, the sharing the data.
Just all of you have emphasised that it's going to be increasingly a responsibility spread across the remit of lots of different government agencies, which I think brings me back to the question of how does regulation keep up? Because currently, there hasn't been a data breach, but it's been conducted by the FCA within one sector, within the remit of one regulator, right? But if you're linking up with energy, if you're linking up especially with DWP, and you're getting vulnerable information on vulnerable people, suddenly you're creating a joined-up data profile of a person which spans potentially half a dozen departments, different banks, different agencies. How do you keep that effective regulatory oversight when it's no longer just a walled garden within financial services?
So the JROC is 3 regulators plus the government. Actually, HMT is sitting on it as well. So from that perspective, we have shown that we can work together and coordinate. But from the perspective of, there will need to be, I think, some mandation, as Marion has said, whether we like this or not. And the regulatory agenda will need to keep up, and therefore we'll need to approach this in a very considered and measured way. We won't be able to go from, 10 miles an hour, if that's where you're saying, to where this could, I think, absolutely drive huge change and innovation for the UK economy. You can't go from 10 to 100 overnight, and we're going to have to think about how we pace that delivery and make sure we bring people and everybody and all parties along with us.
And we go through a similar regulatory challenge with AI. When I was doing the AI white paper last year, we basically didn't create an AI regulator deliberately. We would say, right, how can we skill up and empower each regulator to look at the outcomes, the outputs of AI rather than the technology itself. Rather than bringing in another super regulator or something like that. And likewise, as long as the regulators are talking to each other through JROC and other areas of collaboration, then they can skill up. But we need to have that we need to have an eye on it, exactly as you say, for the reasons that you say.
Yeah, and the truth is, we're all learning as we go. No one government department, no one regulator understands it all, has all the answers, or has even figured it out. And we're learning together. And what I think has been created, and I've been in this role now coming up 2 years, and worked in one of the major banks before that. And what I'm seeing is a level of collaboration like never before. In the payments industry, it was banks, acquirers, card schemes, and consumer groups. Now it's technology companies, it's innovators, we call them TPPs, third-party payment providers. Over 300 innovative companies now working on open banking. There are so many more sectors. Constant dialogue, constant collaboration, being prepared to learn together. I'm learning all the time. Regulators are educating me. I'm educating regulators. We're all educating each other. The teams within Open Banking Limited, 75 people, this is not a big organisation, have become expert at understanding how standards, how communication, how stakeholder management should be management. That should be shared, applied to other sectors, what we've learned, what we've done badly, what we do well. This is figuring it out together because this has never been done before. This is the first time, which is fantastic, very exciting, rather scary, and complex because it's multiple sectors, multiple verticals, multiple stakeholder groups, and it's glib to say collaborate. That has to be done within a framework, within a structure, within a regulatory framework, within a legal framework.
Yep.
And having spent 20 years in payments, and we talk about schemes is that multilateral agreement, a legal agreement between multiple parties, together with a pricing mechanism that is agreed and regulated to manage a fair market, and its rules and its standards, and that's a scheme. And that's what we will need across smart data.
Okay, Hannah, and then...
Yeah, just very quickly, I think, Emma, it's back to your point at the start, getting groups together to deem what is market data sector by sector and what is that kind of pre-competitive element. And a lot of the work that, I'm doing in the energy sustainability space right now is recognising what's the roadmap of different data points that will allow automated, painless, seamless flow of information that already exists. And until we define that and recognising the roles of trade bodies and other groups in kind of paving the way for the North Star of data sharing and open data models, I think we'll go slower, but we have the potential to go a lot faster.
I feel like my job, I just because it's after lunch and everything, there's loads of us, I thought I'd do I'm just doing the devil's advocate about where it's more challenging, and you should take as I said, we think that this is vital to the future of energy, but there are some learnings from energy that I say we should think about quite carefully in terms of where we could go wrong. The best of which is, we are obligated to install smart meters. As the sector, the obligation sits on the energy retailers. I don't know how many of you have been fined up about having a smart meter. I don't know how many of you have told your energy retailer that you don't want one because we're trying to spy on you. We get that more often than you might think. And I don't know how many of you have found it very complicated with your smart meter, or your smart meter hasn't talked to the DCC, or you've had issues, people are nodding. A lot of the issues with the smart meter rollout are there because we were extremely worried about the management of customer data and or had received very explicit concerns about customer data either via MPs or straight to the industry. And we still get that even with a pretty overly managed architecture. The supply license in the UK to be an energy retailer is 2,500 pages long. For you to have a smart meter, the box itself, the collection of the data, the exchanger that the data exchanges information with, and the overall system are all separately regulated with separate standards, and it was all done with this view of privacy in mind and kind of keeping companies' own private data private. This is a really good example of where it can go wrong, where policymakers are very worried about privacy. It's also an example of where the public can become really suspicious if you get a rollout wrong. It's also an example, though, of where the public still has concerns about their privacy. And I agree with you, it's sort of hilarious because we've all just given our data away to Elon and Co. for free. But nevertheless, on things like energy, which is an essential service, people do get protected quite rightly. And so I think there's this, again, it comes down to the role of the regulator to set up a framework which is properly trusted, but to also understand where the limits of that are. And for us, principles-based regulation is the thing. What are the actual outcomes you're trying to achieve for the vulnerable and other consumers in society? And how can you allow the market to deliver to those outcomes rather than kind of prescription? And I think, just to be punchy, as we're at Conservative Conference, we're edging slightly more towards prescription than we are to principles-based at the moment. And that will take a long project to undo before we even get on to doing new things in the sector. Very lastly, there was some really good work done on digitalisation and energy by the Digitalisation Task Force, which was chaired by former Conservative PPS Laura Sands, who's now the chair of the Energy Systems Catapult. Both the Energy Systems Catapult and that task force have really specialised in thinking about a digital energy system, and I would recommend a lot of their work to you if you're interested in this space.
Emma's raised a really interesting point about the early
I was there and I'm still upset about it.
Of smart meters, because if you allowed, it comes back to your point, Henry, if you've got to allow the framework and our understanding of the framework to evolve, to start and to evolve, rather than just expecting a panacea and a great all singing, all dancing thing today. Otherwise, you end up with the walled gardens that you ended up with, SMETS 1, SMETS 2, the like of smart meters, when people couldn't change because otherwise that smart meter was not interoperable.
Yeah.
They ended up with just a box
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff. And that was always the growing pains, wasn't it, that you've got to try and avoid now.
Yeah, and then everyone ends up mad at the industry that would most benefit from doing it and wants to do it because of the services that they can sell you off the back of it, the way they can help look after their customers, the behaviours that we can see on the system. But the regulatory approach has sort of made it something that the sector, it just creates challenging conversations with customers when it should be an opportunity. So I think this point about what the regulators do and what the frameworks are is really important, and it can go not well as well as well.
Right, we're finally going to... I've been having a great time up here, but we're actually going to throw it out to questions at
There's a
this
lot
point.
of
How many microphones do we have? We have 2. So I'll try and go to opposite sides of the room, but we may end up over here for more of it. We'll have the gentleman in the front row there, and we'll have the gentleman in third in from the aisle there with your hand up, sir. Thank you, yes. Thank you, and then we'll just go up and down the panel. Has a microphone reached you? You go first if you've got a microphone.
Okay, so I'm Alok from Watford. My question really is around trust and reliability of the systems. Now, open AI and being able to share data, my suspicion, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is that the government or other people will get hold of it and use it for purposes that it's not meant to be for. How can you assure us that that's not going to happen? The second thing is hacking and potential problems with that. I mean, they're the trust being the main thing, and also with CBDC coming in, how do you think that will impact what we do, and will we end up with digital ID?
Thank you. And sir?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask the panel, what do they think in terms of consistency amongst the regulators? Obviously, all of you have spoken about wanting to encourage open banking, possibly this model, and bring it into other FS sectors. But actually, in terms of industry wanting to do this and being encouraged to do this, would the panel not agree that consistency from the regulators, messaging from this, is crucial to vest in confidence amongst industry, especially if this is to go into a broader field of FS services?
Yep.
Okay, I think we'll start with Cherie, as these are both sort of regulatory questions.
So I will come to the messaging one first. So yes, we have to have a consistent message, and that's why we have formed that group around the open banking, which is quite important to make sure that all of the areas and the regulators involved and participating in that process were aligned and are working together to make sure it works. So that will be critical as this rolls out. In answer to your question, I mean, I will hand to Marion in terms of your question over security, because the key point here is yes, I made the point that we're going to have to give the public confidence around that security model and ensuring that it isn't being seen and isn't being used for other purposes, which it's not. But that needs to come from the people who are leading it, rather than the regulators just saying, trust me, it's not.
All right.
So there were 2 questions. Do you want us to answer both of them?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so the whole security thing, this whole thing of openness, I think back and I remember my late mum, she would write a cheque. It would have all her bank account details on it, her name, it would have her signature, and then she would write her address and her telephone number on the back of it and happily hand it over. And that's what we used to do, and it was on paper, and there wasn't the internet and there wasn't this sharing thing. The fact is that the trust framework around open banking, you have to be certificated. You have to have a security certificate. It's not free for all. You have to register with open banking. There are certificates, there are tools, there is cybercrime tools. We've not had a single breach since it was formed. We have no security challenges to date. We have accessibility from time to time, and that will depend on different institutions. That doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen. That doesn't mean to say that we're infallible. It's about utilising the best of security, the best talent, and a combination of players to make us as strong as we possibly can be. And, I'm not the person to take you through an enterprise architecture framework, but we can do that, all right? Security and trust is the currency of everything we do. Without that, we are nothing. And that's where the main focus of everything in open banking goes. in terms of evolving that to other sectors, it's using those learnings, it's using those standards. These are technical messages. They are not names and addresses that turn up on people's desks. These are encrypted messages. And we need to use the best of technology to make it stronger and safer than it is today and manage that narrative around that. I think the question over here was more about regulatory. Just reframe that for me.
Consistency amongst regulators to industry, which we rolled out as well.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to my point of we're figuring this out together. JROC, clue in the title, Joint Regulatory Oversight Committee, 4 regulators with different powers, different remits, different duties that come together to talk it through. We're going to need to do the same as we go cross-sector. But if you hold pure the technical standards, the security standards, the trust services and framework standards, the directory quality, all the components that are needed to make this safe and secure. Keep that consistent, and that's why I mentioned the word scheme before, rules. To play, you've got to sign up to the rules. If you breach those rules, you can no longer play. It's like a payment scheme, yeah? So that needs to go across the different sectors. This is possible to do, but we're going to need far many more forums. And we were talking earlier about there aren't that many trade bodies that cross the sectors. Is there a cybersecurity trade body? Is there a digital identity? There might be. Well, I don't know about it, so come and talk to me. Digital identity spans right across all the sectors. Interestingly, before I joined Open Banking, I went onto the board of a startup in digital identity. One of the first significant customers was a football club. I won't name which one. But I grew up in Luton, and these were our arch rivals. So I found it very interesting. And the reason that the football club wanted digital identity, they had to clean up their act in terms of security in the ground. So they needed to know that the face that came through the turnstiles was the name and address of the person they thought it was, and that they had been checked. And they're using open banking to do that.
Can I just pick up on the second half of your question about confidence? I think the thing is with when you talk about digital identity, I mean, actually, frankly, I'm sort of like reasonably comfortable with digital identity myself, personally. Why? Because I've got a unique taxpayer reference, I've got a national insurance number, I've sort of got that anyway. And that can get me into HMRC's systems, etc. And as long as and as Marion says, it's encrypted. So as long as until quantum computing comes along, encryption is pretty solid, and there's no way government have the ability or the interest in hacking your data. To hack your particular individual data is a ridiculously massive thing to do. If you want to hack 1 million people's data, you might be able to do that for data leaks that we were talking about. But to get to you, frankly, that's just a waste of everybody. Actually, what you do, the easiest way of doing that is human behaviour. Is making sure I can get your data by a rogue phone call. That's way easier than having the entire government computer system coming and attacking you. That's just pragmatics. But in terms of signing on, in terms of using that digital identity, I can already log on and register with any number of organisations, companies, and what have you, using my Facebook login, using my Twitter login, using Google or whatever like that. So you have that. What we were looking at in terms of government is digital identity in the Digital Identity Bill was having it as a passport. So it's not government collecting your information and keeping a load of stuff about you. It's not even collaborating the information. It's literally a check. So actually, if someone says, oh, do I know Paul Scully? So yeah, I do. So you're good to go. That's it. That's all you need to do. So when we have a lot of data upon someone, why can't we just be just a check, really, that, oh, I know this guy. It's a verification rather than an ID, if you like.
Can we just, and also Henry's gone because he was absolutely heroically managing to chair a meeting whilst also having a nosebleed, which is... Yeah, I mean, that's like party conferences day 2, isn't it?
We're testing dual identity by me just substituting.
Yeah.
I'm not Henry Hill.
So I hope he's all right. But that was sort of
okay.
fair play to him.
Okay.
Your question about, I just wanted to answer directly your question about regulators, which is I think there's a lot of co-working going on between some of the regulators at the moment, and in particular in my world there's a conversation about whether we can learn from some financial regulation in the energy sector. And the new government, I think I'm right about this, the new government has proposed an office for regulators and is trying to convene the regulators more often to have cross-cutting conversations about things like cybersecurity or data sharing. Be interested to see where that goes. And then the question on security, I mean, we did quite a lot of work on cybersecurity and security in general. Obviously, we manage critical national infrastructure. There are pretty good controls and protections in place. Largely on this and on protection in general, when I think about energy, we're either after data sets that already exist, so DWP already knows who is in receipt of benefits, for example. The idea is that we can put up a safe architecture in place to share that information with suppliers who might not know. Similarly, suppliers might know who's self-disconnecting more often, even though they're not showing as vulnerable. So it's sharing existing data sets in a way that's safe between bodies that have sensible governance to get to a more open system of the kind we're talking about in the financial sector. I would imagine is something we'd roll out slowly through different kinds of consumer groups. And the reason I say that is we are very careful with, the households that we're targeting for vulnerability support. The consumer groups are always careful to put protections in place around particular households and so on. And some of the data we have is very sensitive. So the short answer to your question is we manage this sort of risk all the time. We've got pretty good controls in place. The UK, if anything, tends to over-regulate rather than under-regulate, and all of you gave your data away for free pretty happily to companies without really questioning it 10 years ago. And often where there are questions about data, they tend to be, I find people's concerns about privacy are often not necessarily targeted at the bit that is the real problem, frankly. I think in energy, a lot of those risks are already managed away, or we wouldn't be starting with the riskier things anyway. Yeah, we'd be trying to start with things that are actually a benefit where we already have the information.
Thank you. We have time for one quick question, if it's a short question. And go to gentleman there. Mike's coming to you.
Hi, it's Matt Kilcoyne from the Open Data Institute. The Prime Minister last week said that there would be the introducing of the new fraud bill, and you talked about consent mechanisms and about building trust. That will allow bank access data without consent. Is that a concern for you that you're going to lose a lot of public trust in open banking and also more generally across data sharing if that's introduced and pushed through?
Yep. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I think potentially, but we have to manage that message. And there's an interesting thing going on here in terms of consent and where consent. I was approached by the Met, seeing if there was any way that we could remove consent on terrorist bank accounts, because had they been able to do that with the Manchester atrocity and trace where the money was going and coming from more quickly, it took them 6 weeks. Under the current legislation and compliance you have to go through to get access without consent, they could have traced, where the money was coming from and therefore what was behind this. And so there's always an argument for cases without consent, and that's an extreme one, but there will be others. We've seen some of this with some of the challenges around APP scams, where the bank account holder saying, yes, pay, and the bank thinks, no, this is clearly going to be a scam. Who wins there? And so that's working its way through consultation as well. So I think there's always a case for non-consent, but I think it has to be tightly controlled, it has to be definitely regulated, and it has to be for good reason. In terms of managing the message, I think we all need to do a lot better between what consent means and what it doesn't mean. And people have given consent and they don't even know they're giving consent. Yeah. And how many of us get fed up? I never know what to click on. Do you want cookies? Or don't you want cookies? Or do you want these, that? Oh my God, who knows? When you're overseas, do you click euro or do you click sterling or do you click something else? Nobody really knows because we don't educate well enough and we're not clear enough in our narrative. So I think there is a case, but I think it has to be controlled and we all have to manage the narrative, to my earlier point.
Cool. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today on the panel, but thank you to all of you who joined us today in the room. Thank you to Open Banking for sponsoring this event. And if I can get a round of applause for all of our panellists today, Hannah, Emma, Marion, Paul and Sheree. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Always happy to have